En við erum svo heppin að fá marga góða gesti hérna í dag eins og ég kom inn á og hér komin sérfræðingur sem heitir Karen Hughes. Hún frá heilsugæslunni í Wales, prófessor við Bangor háskóla í Wales og sérfræðingur hjá Alþjóðaheilbrigðismálastofnunni. Það sem hún hefur helst verið að skoða og kemur til með að ræða hérna á eftir sem sagt tengsl ofbeldis og áfalla í æsku við geðræna erfiðleika seinna í lífinu og það verður áhugavert að heyra það. Karen Hughes, velkom. Give it a gott klapp.
Okay, good morning everyone and thank you. I apologise, I'm going to speak in English, so I hope I'm understandable to everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me here today. It really is an honour to come and have the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and their impact on mental health. I'm not a mental health professional, my field is public health, but you can't have good public health if you don't have good mental health. And what I'm interested in is understanding some of the drivers of some of the big public health problems that we see in modern society, and adverse childhood experiences I think really are one of these. For those of you that aren't familiar with the phrase, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're commonly referred to, it's an umbrella term to describe a wide range of stressful experiences that children can have when they're growing up that can affect them directly, such as being a victim of child abuse or neglect, or that can affect the environment in which they live, such as growing up with parents who abuse alcohol or drugs or being exposed to domestic violence. Research consistently shows that these kinds of experiences are among the strongest predictors of mental ill health right across the life course. But they're also one of the strongest predictors of many other health-harming behaviours, of physical ill health, of not doing well at school, of not doing well in employment, of becoming involved in crime, and ultimately of dying at an early age. ACEs, however, are preventable and their impacts can be avoided. So many people experience these kinds of childhood traumas and don't go on to have problems in later life. And what I want to try and get across today is that looking at things through the ACE kind of framework gives you a way of getting all agencies, health, social services, education, criminal justice, with a shared understanding of some of the big problems we see in society and a shared agenda of working towards the same goals, which ultimately is going to really improve mental health. So there's been lots of research in the last few years about adverse childhood experiences as understanding of its importance has grown, including from the World Health Organization, who have done a range of surveys with young students, 18 to 25-year-olds, particularly in Eastern Europe. And these surveys tend to do questionnaires with adults, asking them about the experiences they had in childhood so that they can then look at the impact of that on their health as adults or as young adults or in the general population. And the ones in Europe have looked at the ACEs listed, so physical, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect, growing up in a household with domestic violence, with parental separation, mental illness, alcohol or drug abuse and incarceration or somebody going to a prison. Just to give you an idea of the prevalence of these kind of experiences in people's childhood history, in Europe, this is for the proportion of young students or young adults who've grown up with somebody in the household who was mentally ill. It's about 1 in 10 overall. The prevalence for the individual countries that the surveys come from is shown. And this is the prevalence or the levels for the other types of experiences that people are reporting. We've done several of these surveys at a national population level in the last year or so in England and in Wales. The prevalence for the rates that we've found in our general adult population are shown here. It tends to range from about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 for things like parental separation, emotional abuse, down to about 1 in 20 or lower for living in a household with a drug abuser or somebody who's gone to prison. But what the ACE work does is it brings it all together and looks at the extent of adverse childhood experiences in people's lives. And what you see when you bring this together is that around about half of the adult population have suffered at least one of these types of experiences when growing up. And around about 1 in 10 have suffered 4 or more. So this isn't something that affects a minority of a population. It's something that affects a very large proportion of people. It's a big population issue. So each of the individual types of adverse childhood experience that we've mentioned can increase people's risks of mental illness on its own. This figure just shows from the World Mental Health Surveys in 21 countries that any of these individual types of experiences when growing up can increase people's risks of developing mental illness at any point across the life course, so right through from childhood up to later adulthood. But in fact, most people who suffer one type of adverse childhood experience also suffer another type. In Wales, in our latest survey that we just finished this year, 96% of people who report physical neglect also reported at least one more ACE. 93% of those who reported physical abuse, 90% of those who reported alcoholism in their household, and 81% that reported mental illness. And importantly, the more adverse childhood experiences that people suffer in childhood, the greater their risks of mental ill health. And this is important because if you're looking at doing something around prevention, if you focus on one type of adverse childhood experience, the impact you're likely to have will be lessened because people tend to be exposed to many of them. So as I said, the impact of ACEs is cumulative, which means that the more people suffer, the greater their risks of poor health outcomes. And this data is, again, from our latest Welsh survey, looking at the proportion of the population that report currently receiving treatment for a mental illness, based on how many adverse childhood experiences they had when growing up. And you can see that it increases from 9% in those who had no ACEs in their childhood history, up to 30% in those who had 4 or more, so one in 3. For having ever been treated for a mental illness, it increases from 23% in those with no ACEs up to 64%, so 2/3 of those with 4 or more ACEs. And it's a similar story for having ever felt suicidal or self-harming, increasing from 6% up to 39%. And when you control for age, gender, socioeconomic deprivation, we see in Wales that having 4 or more ACEs increases your risk of current mental illness by 4 times, 6 times for ever having mental illness treatment, and almost 10 times for ever having self-harmed or felt suicidal. But this is just one study. We've also recently conducted a meta-analysis, a systematic review, bringing together global studies that have used a similar methodology and looking at the increased risk in people with 4 or more ACEs. So globally, around the increased risk of having anxiety, depression or low life satisfaction is about 4 times higher compared to those without ACEs in their childhood. For violence, it's about 8 times higher. For suicide, very strong, it's about 30 times higher. But also for problem drug use, problem alcohol use, illicit drug use, smoking, heavy alcohol use, risky sexual behaviour, teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, physical inactivity and obesity, and critically, also some of the leading causes of death that we see today, cancers, heart disease, respiratory disease. All of these things are significantly increased in people who suffer adverse childhood experience. So it really is a major health issue. When we've done our surveys in Wales, we've presented the data to people in simple infographics. This just shows from our latest survey that for every 100 adults in Wales, 50 have suffered at least one ACE and 14 have suffered 4 or more. I just thought to show the extent of adversity in people who suffer from mental health issues, I'd use this figure to demonstrate from the Eastern European ACE surveys amongst those young people who've ever attempted suicide. And you can see here, 92% have had at least one ACE and 45% say they've got 4 or more. And we recently also did a sample of people from a substance misuse treatment service in England. And here, 95% have at least one ACE and 64% have 4 or more ACEs. So it really is a big issue that's affecting people in mental health services. And I think the important thing here is I don't know what the situation is here in Iceland, but in the UK, we don't routinely ask people about their childhood history. histories in substance use services and mental health services. And I think it's really important when you're trying to give people appropriate treatment that you do have an understanding of this. It's not just, obviously, mental illness and treatment services. This is the prevalence of low mental well-being in the general population. Again, from the Wales data, it increases from 14% in those with no ACEs up to 41% in those with 4 or more ACEs. And we measured this by using a common scale of mental well-being that asked people how often in the last 2 weeks they'd been feeling relaxed, close to people, thinking clearly, a range of problems. Those with ACEs were more likely to say they'd never or rarely been feeling these in the last 2 weeks. But I'm just showing this because I think it's important when you think about how you provide treatment or you work with people who might have suffered ACEs. If people don't feel close to each other, that's going to affect the relationship that they can have with people who are with public services. If they're not thinking clearly, this might affect how well they can stick to their treatment patterns. And if they don't feel optimistic about the future, this might affect their outlook on life in general. So it really is critical to have an understanding of it. So what I'm going to do is just say a little bit about why adverse childhood experiences can have such a big impact on mental illness. And there's lots of theories of why adverse childhood experiences affect people's health in later life. It can be genetics, it can be a learnt behaviour, lots of areas. But the thing that we look at in using the adverse childhood experiences framework is about the impact of childhood trauma on the developing brain. Humans are probably the most adaptable creature on the planet. We're born helpless at a very early age, and we have a long period of growth and development throughout childhood where we have to learn to live and to adapt and to function in the very complex social world that we live in. When a baby's born, its brain is about 25% of its adult's weight, and it's reached 80% by the age of age 2. So the first few years of life in particular are a period of very rapid brain development where there's billions of cells and trillions of synapses or connections between cells are built up. And over childhood, they're strengthened or pruned by the environment in which they live. And much of this is about how they interact with other humans, so how they learn to connect. If you grow up in a safe and nurturing environment, you learn things like attachment, trust, empathy, community, all the important functions that we need to function well within modern society. But if you grow up in a violent and unpredictable childhood environment, it's a very different story. You don't necessarily get the opportunity to lay these foundations in your brain, but your system can develop around fear and short-term survival, which has a really big impact on stress response, on your immune system, and on your allostatic load. So chronic stress, this is real chronic stress from childhood environments, can increase lots of problems. So this is how, for example, stress impacts on the body, and everybody goes through stress. It's not a bad thing. And what happens is when you're faced with a threat, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your muscle tension, and your stress hormones all increase, and you can enter the fight or flight kind of mode. And then once that's resolved, when your systems were been taught how to deal with it, you might go through a period of exhaustion, but you'll recover and come back to normal. But if you don't get the opportunity to learn that due to chronic stress, you can get stuck at this high kind of period of of tension. You get a fixed allostatic load. So really what happens is it can overdevelop the life-preserving parts of the brain, which means that children who grow up in very violent environments are actually very well adapted to living in a violent world. But the problem is that in their biological expectations are then at odds with the social expectations that they actually live in. And this has big impacts, for example, when they go to school. If you're anxious, if you're always looking over your shoulder and you don't trust people, it's going to impact on your ability to learn. And that obviously has big impacts throughout life. Neutral cues can look threatening, so people can react as if people are being aggressive to them when in fact they're not, because they don't know how to read faces. In relationships, you can lack trust with people, have poor communication communication skills. And ultimately, being in this place of heightened stress a lot places the body under a lot of wear and tear, which can actually impact on your vulnerability to disease just because your body is placed under so much stress. And this is important to say, this is chronic stress, and it's not something that is going to impact on everyone. But adverse childhood experiences do have an impact throughout the life course. Starting from the very earliest stages of life, they can disrupt the nervous, hormonal, immune development. In children, they affect social, emotional learning. When people move into adolescence, they can increase adoption of health-harming behaviours, involvement in crime. In adulthood, it leads into non-communicable disease, disability, social problems, low productivity, and ultimately, bringing all this together, early death. Often we invest in the top. That's where a lot of our spending comes in adults, in the social problems that we see. What the Adverse Childhood Experiences Framework is about trying to shift spending and investment down to the earlier years. So health, social, educational, criminal justice systems, investing in early life to actually focus on building stronger children and breaking down the cycles that we see with adversity. Because adverse childhood experiences are a cycle, people who grow up in these environments are vulnerable to so many health problems that they're then at increased risk of exposing their own children. So we need to break this cycle, and that's about preventing ACEs in the first place, building resilience in children so that they are strong and they can avoid the effects of ACEs, and also, for those people who are suffering the effects of ACEs, making sure that the people who in public services recognise the impacts of them and are able to support them effectively. I'm not going to talk much about prevention. Just briefly, some of the key things that can work to prevent child maltreatment are around parenting programmes, nurse home visiting, parent training, preschool enrichment programmes. All these kind of programmes can reduce child maltreatment. They can also prevent parental stress and depression and child conduct problems, so they impact on mental health as well. They can increase children's school completion, increase their opportunities for employment, and reduce violence, and therefore they can help break down cycles. And there's lots of information out there on what works to prevent child maltreatment, that's available if people would like it. There's also that you can use adverse childhood experiences as a screening framework to identify people who might need help within health services and other services. For example, the Safe Environment for Every Kid programme in the USA uses screening for parents in paediatric or child primary care systems, where it asks parents about whether they're experiencing depression or stress or substance abuse or intimate partner violence, and if they do, they then get the option to refer them over to a counselling support to try and help the parent and therefore prevent the adverse childhood experience. And there's also a lot of work at the moment looking at whether you can screen adult patients in health and other services for a history of adverse childhood experiences to help inform their treatment. There's some anecdotal evidence coming out of the USA that this can actually help reduce health service use. Just by talking about it, it helps people understand their own problems and deal with them better. And we're looking at this in Wales at the moment about evaluation of these kinds of programmes. In terms of building resilience, as I've said, not everyone who suffers ACEs develops problems. And having resilience is about having the ability to turn toxic stress into tolerable stress. And the things that are important in this are like feeling you can guide your own destiny, being equipped to manage your behaviour and your emotions, being grounded in cultural traditions and connected to your community, and having, very importantly, tends to be one of the most important one, having at least one stable, caring relationship with an adult throughout your childhood is really important. And things that can build this are around social and emotional development programmes in school, mentoring programmes, having effective and supportive services. And we've just started looking at resilience in our most recent ACE survey in Wales. We know what the problem is in Wales. We're now trying to look at what might help prevent it. So we've looked at childhood resilience, and this just shows compares people with low childhood resilience resources to high childhood resilience resources for the proportion that have ever felt suicidal or self-harmed by how many ACEs you can have. And you can see in the 4 or more ACE category, it more than halves the levels of people that are suffering mental health problems here. But importantly, it also more than halves it in those without ACEs. So if you can build resilience, you can protect mental health regardless of whether people have ACEs or not. So I'm going to finish by talking just a little bit about what we're doing in Wales. I'm sure you know where Wales is. It's part of the United Kingdom. It's a small country with a population of about 3 million. It's rural, it's mountainous, it's not too dissimilar in places from Iceland. We have a devolved administration. So while we are part of the United Kingdom, we have our own government, and our government for the last 10 years or so has had responsibility for a lot of its own services, so health, education, housing, local government. So we do have the ability to make our own strategies and our laws. And one of the most important pieces of legislation that the Welsh Government has put in place has been the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which means that public bodies in Wales are required to think about the long-term impact of the decisions that they make and the services that they put in place. They have to work better with people, communities and each other, and they have to work to prevent some persistent problems such as poverty and health inequalities. So any service or decision that a public service makes in Wales, they have to say, what impact is this going to have on the next generation, and am I improving things for the next generation when I do this? So this is the kind of like framework that or the setting that we had when we did our first adverse childhood experience study. And as I say, we presented it in very simple infographics showing people just how many people in Wales were affected by adverse childhood experiences, what the impact of those childhood experiences were on health and social problems and criminal justice problems, but importantly, what potential benefit there was in preventing ACEs in the population. And this just shows that if you took ACEs out of the equation, if there were no ACEs in our surveys that we'd done, then you could reduce violence by more than half. You could reduce drug use by probably around half, high-risk problematic drinking by about a third. So there's huge benefits for people to gain from actually preventing ACEs within populations. So this has really been picked up very well across Wales, and we've seen a big shift over the last few years in how public services think about people and about public health. We've seen lots of staff training around this across the board. We've seen changes to practice, and we've seen much more interagency working. And one of the first sectors to pick this up was, in fact, the police, who are often one of the first people to pick up on many ideas because they are action-oriented. And they very clearly could see that I think about 90% of the call-outs to people's houses that they were going to were not for crime. They were for complex domestic issues where they were seeing domestic violence, substance use, mental illness, and that was taking up a huge part of their workload. So they could see the benefits of engaging in this straight away. So we have seen lots of investment in police in terms of training, teaching people about vulnerability, better referral patterns, and how they work and how they think about families that they go and see all the time. Rather than just seeing them as a problem family, they understand the issues they're facing much more, and they are much more able to support them. So work as well in youth justice, which is really important, so people just entering the youth justice system being treated not as a future criminal, but as somebody who's had a traumatic past and needs help. We're seeing in health services work around routine inquiry, trauma specialist GPs, looking at how you can better provide parenting support for people using understanding of ACEs. And all this is very much in its early years and is all undergoing evaluation, but also around schools, housing, sexual assault services, prisons. Really, everybody is getting on board this agenda very enthusiastically. Welsh Government has funded because things have happened so fast, it's funded a hub where we can bring together all the information and learning together and try and provide a consistent response to this. So this is about awareness of ACE and making sure the workforce is fully understanding of it, their knowledge, their skills, their communities, their partnership, all the information that's needed to get a community approach to prevention, response and resilience building. And in fact, the Welsh Government released their national strategy for Wales last month. It had 5 priority areas, and within this were early years and mental health. So they're 2 of the 5 key priorities for Wales now, and they've made a commitment within that national strategy to develop ACE-aware public services which take a more preventative approach to avoid ACEs and improve the resilience of children and young people. So this is a huge shift within just 2 years within Wales based on understanding of this, and if you can improve it, it's going to have a real benefit for mental health across the life course. So just to summarise, adverse childhood experiences are one of the strongest predictors of mental illness and many other poor outcomes across the life course, and they need to be a consideration across the life course as well, and that's about prevention. If you prevent ACEs, you will benefit mental health, along with physical health, education, employment, crime, lots and lots of benefits to preventing ACEs. Building resilience can buffer children who suffer ACEs against their effects, and they can also improve mental health across the general population. And services that can understand and address ACEs can be much more effective for those who've been affected by them, so you need to have a good understanding within the service. Health, social, education and criminal justice sectors all benefit from starting on the right life trajectory, and because of the cyclical cycle of ACEs, poor health, deprivation, that if you can fix it once and break this cycle, there's potentially very long-lasting intergenerational benefits from doing so. Okay, thank you very much.